Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about concepts for cutting focus number 1. The first thing that I would recommend that you do before you start going through this is make sure you train with a proper sword. So what I'd recommend is use a proper weighted sword, just because, again, you're going to learn more from, again, cutting focuses and doing your forms with a heavier sword than you are with a super light sword. So I'm going to be using the sword that I always have on me, but I'm going to use my iron sword as we go through this. And ideally, for the cutting focus, if you also want to use anything with a blood groove, right? So for example, with this one, we do in fact have a blood groove, just so you can have some feedback on your cutting angle. So I guess alternatively, so this is going to be kind of contrary to what I just said, if you're just working on the cutting angles, you can use your paper cutting sword. If you're not familiar with it, they look sort of like this, right? So this is usually associated with paper cutting. If you do not have this actual piece of equipment, don't worry about it, right? So you can still paper cut without paper cutting sword. You can still get good cutting angles without paper cutting sword. It's just a nice thing. Now, one thing to note if you are using a paper cutting sword as you go through the cutting focus is that these are extremely light. So it's not going to give you actually real feedback, at least not as much as you would like. Also, these guys tend to be more accepting of bad angles than a proper sword. So for example, like this is nice because you can get a nice, right, that kind of sound. Even if I have a little bit of a bad angle, right, so this would not whoosh if I was using my proper sword. So those weren't great angles, but they still sounded about the same. And I think my cuts were really off because I was thinking so much about this. But it's just one thing to keep in mind, right? So if you are using a paper cutting sword, keep the feedback with a grain of salt, but the major thing that if you do use this, hear where it accelerates. So for example, this would be a little bit easier if I'm over here. This might sound good, right? It's like, oh, it's whistling. That's good. But notice the extension and notice when you hear the noise. Now obviously because there's distance between this and the camera, the sound's not going to match up perfectly, but listen for the difference, right? So there's so Exhibit A, as my students like to hear, right? Versus, hear the difference? So although the sound itself might be about the same, the extension is very, very different. So notice when you can hear when it's fully extended. Again, if you use this, keep that in mind, your actual sword is going to be give you a little more feedback that way. So as you're going through Sangsu Gumbo Yonban, you're also going to be going through the cutting focus number 1. So for me, again, this seems like kind of like a weird time to do it, but this is, so one thing that this focus does work on is your diagonal cuts, right? Now it's going to be true for other portions of the cutting focus, not just number 1. But if we take a look, right, so we always draw into a nice kimase and then tenjok, right? Always make sure you're in this defense, right? Don't be like, and then start going into your combination, right? So always start defense, and from here, again, we're going to be working on our diagonal cuts. Now you introduce your diagonal cuts in Sangsu 2, so that's probably would be a nice way for you to introduce that as well. But if you're here, so the very beginning of it is simply just down, up, right? Now, what did you notice with that? So one thing that you can do with this, this combination specifically is actually feel the power of just a diagonal. So one thing that Sangsu 2 does, what Sangsu 2 does that this one doesn't, is you're moving with the cut. This one, you're just stationary, right? So there's, again, a reason we're going to be using our kimase, so you can still engage your hips, right? But you're not moving your mass in any way. Now, obviously, that's going to help you actually cut when you get to Form 2. But if you just start with this, right? So down, up, notice how much you can just work on that. So you don't have your lower body helping you with the cut. You're just doing it with your core, with your deep shoulder, and all that fun stuff, right? So from here, it's just working on getting a powerful cut. So one thing I would focus on if you're doing a cutting focus number 1 is make sure you're in good preparation, right? So there are a couple ways you can kind of teach this, right? So some people teach it, notice if you look stuff in the mirror, where the blade is entering your shoulder, where it should be leaving under your floating rib. One thing I like to do is here, right? So I should have almost like a fist between the middle of my forearm and my head. I like to also teach that this part, so you can kind of notice the seam in my uniform, it should shrug up as I engage that deep shoulder. And notice I'm going to use my hips as I cut, right? So it's not just, this is very weak, right? And very bad. Versus, if you engage the hips, so notice my hips are actually moving back as I prepare for the cut, here, and cut, right? I'm going to transition, so notice I'm not going to do this, right? This doesn't cut anything. This probably wouldn't cut flour. Versus, right, so if we cut down, engage the hip, kick it back as you cut forward. So again, the mass of the sword is going forward, the mass of your hips are going back for a nice counteraction, right? So you're going to cut forward with your cut, right? So again, remember, your target is right in front of you. So you're not kind of offside cutting this way, kind of like what you do in Sang Soo 9. You're straight on with your opponent, right? So if I'm here, I won't be doing cuts like this, or I'm kind of cutting off into the ether. I'm cutting you, right? So if I'm here, check, good preparation, right? So make sure as you're looking at your students that they can look underneath their arm, not on top of it, right? So if you're here, and again, engage your deep shoulder, shift that up, and as you kick your hips back, cut, right? And as you prepare, right, again, kick your hips, that's a really great phrase, kick your hips back as you throw your tip forward. So don't throw it across, right? The idea is I'm trying to hit you in the rib. So forward with the cut. And then other side, so same thing. Notice the seam shifts up, I'm preparing, cut down, shift, again, I'm not shifting this way, right? Kick your hips back as you cut forward. Make sense? So that's the first thing I would like you to focus on, right? So engage your core, engage the way your deep shoulders are shifting as you engage into that cut. See how your hips move, see how your core moves, and see how much your knees move. Because, and I think we mentioned this in my basics video, as you do your diagonal and uppercuts, you shouldn't have your knees pointing anywhere except your opponent, right? So your toes should be generally facing your opponent. Your knees generally facing forward. Your hips generally facing forward. Now they can shift a little bit, but by no means should you be doing this kind of thing, especially in this combination. So one thing to keep in mind is, imagine you're exactly as the stance tells you. You're in horse riding stance. So actually this is one thing that's kind of just interesting from a side point, our kimase is actually closer to what you're actually going to be doing when you're horseback riding as opposed to the taekwondo horsebacks. Like if you ride a horse like this, that's weird. Versus horseback riding, right? So if you're actually trying to ride a little more, swiftly forward, this is actually going to be closer to the stance you're going to be engaging in. So imagine you are in fact, on a horse. So if you cut, you're going to kind of decapitate your own horse. So imagine the horse is, forward, right? So the head is forward. You can cut up this way. Ideally not, maim your horse, right? As opposed to if you cut more across, you're going to notice how much you're going to steer your horse astray. So imagine again, riding a horse. You don't want to lead them one way or the other with your knees. You just want straight on. Another aspect I'd like you to think about is the fluidity of transition. So this is going to be a little bit different from what we're going to be doing in part 2, right? But the fluidity of transition. So what we're doing is we're turning here, cutting. So we're not doing, I just cut you. I'm going to flip my sword and cut you again. No, these are all meant to be like bang, 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 right? So if we're going there, so as I cut, so it should be so nice, powerful cut. As I transition, smoothly transition, use your hip as it turns to cut forward. And as it cuts forward, don't stop here, right? I'm trying to cut you again. So I just cut you on this side. You probably think I'm going to be coming back down this way. Just kidding, right? Now I'm going to be coming down here, cut, fluidity, shift, right? What's nice here is, after you just do this one, guess what you're doing? Just kidding, bang, right? Bang, 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 right? So you have all those nice transition points that you can focus on. That aspect is going to transition over to a lot of different parts of your form and your kyakyang. So what I'm thinking about particularly is kyakyang number 2, right? So if you do the 1, 2, 3, notice the transition. So 1, bang, right? As you shift again, as you turn your blade, shift, cut, right? So you want to have that nice transition this way. You're not wasting any energy changing the angle of the blade. You're letting your whole body just shift it as fluidly as you can, right? So if you want to, you can do something kind of silly like this, right? Now obviously this is not powerful, but they can make it bigger and bigger and bigger until you feel like it's powerful and has a nice strong transition. And the third aspect I would like you to focus on is know where your tip is. So again, that might sound kind of obvious as we go through this, but again, like ideally you're trying to cut someone with the last third of your blade because it's going both the fastest, also generally is the sharpest, right? So that's really where you want to be cutting. By doing your cutting focus without moving your body with it, like you would in Sanxu 2, for example, this is going to help you, again, create awareness of where your blade is going, right? So as we go through it, right? So as we're here and I'm cutting forward, I should know exactly where the tip is, where my distance is. So if I'm here, I'm not trying to cut low, I'm not trying to cut high, I'm trying to cut straight into someone's neck, right? So if I'm here, I have to see where it extends out, right? As I follow through. Same thing here. The tip doesn't want to be like, ooh, this way, right? I want to cut, smooth transition. So that tip should not veer off that much. So it should be here, roll, straight into another cut, and again, other side, cutting in, right? So notice where the blade is. So one thing to keep in mind is, obviously where the tip of the sword is, but where the tip of the sword is with relation to what you're doing with your hips. That might sound weird, but in general, wherever the tip is going, you want your hips to go in the opposite direction. Subtly, right? So I don't want you to be like, right? That's gonna be weird. But subtly enough so you can, compensate within your body. Now for drills, it's gonna be really, really boring in this time around. Go through your cutting focus number 1 with these 3 aspects in mind, right? So again, you want to be thinking about, again, how to engage the power in into your dive cuts, how you can have that nice smooth transition between cuts, as well as awareness of where the tip is. So keep all those 3 things in mind as you go through your cutting focus. Then, so do your cutting focus, maybe 5-10 times, and then apply the same concepts to your form. With that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong!